Ok, bienvenue dans notre émission African Variety Show. Là, nous sommes en direct de Channel 17 Town Meeting TV. Et bien sûr, aujourd'hui, ça fait une année que notre émission a commencé. Donc, c'est notre anniversaire ici dans cette chaîne. Et nous avons le réel plaisir sur ce plateau de recevoir aujourd'hui Dr Catherine Antley. Et vous allez la découvrir tout à l'heure. Alors, chers téléspectateurs, téléspectatrices de notre télévision Town Meeting Channel 17, en premier lieu, notre émission aujourd'hui, nous allons parler un tout petit peu d'une compétition internationale qui s'organise en Afrique du Sud, dans la province de Limpopo, le 24 septembre 2022. Il s'agit de Miss Heritage Global, à laquelle dans cette compétition, nous avons une Congolaise qui va nous représenter valablement. Elle répond au nom de Jules Djunga. Jules Djunga, c'est la candidate de la République démocratique du Congo. Alors, un tout petit peu en anglais, on dit Miss Heritage Global is about celebrating the heritage and the diverse cultures of the world. It not only does the organization promote unity in cultural diversity through pageantry, it has established its global footprint and brand across 80 countries. As a result, it has created a new generation of young women who are proud of their roots and heritage and embrace the heritage and culture of the others, bringing nations together through their diversity. So for the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC is represented by Jules Djunga, candidate number 10, at the Miss Heritage Global International Competition organized by South Africa on September 24th. This world event, which aims to make the cultures, values, and riches of different countries, will see the participation of 53 countries. Note that the final for the 2022 edition, bringing together 53 other candidates from 53 different nations, will be held in Limpopo province of South Africa. And for the moment, the votes of different candidates have been taking place on Facebook since July 15th. Candidate of the Democratic Republic of Congo received the support of the ambassador of the DRC in South Africa, Mr. Fidele Moulaja Binene, who promised to accompany our ambassador until the end of the said competition. Alors, qu'est-ce que nous venons de dire là? Donc, nous avons notre candidate Jules Djunga qui va représenter la République démocratique du Congo dans cette compétition internationale appelée Miss Heritage Global. Alors, nous demandons à tous les Congolais partout où vous êtes et tous les amis de pouvoir aller dans sa page Facebook Jules Djunga et vous allez cliquer et elle est candidate numéro 10. Donc, le vote se passe chaque jour, donc vous avez le droit de voter une fois par jour jusqu'au 23 septembre. Nous allons voir les images et là, le soutien total du pays, du gouvernement et de notre ambassadeur qui vit en Afrique du Sud. Alors nous demandons à tout le monde de voter pour lui, pour elle plutôt. Vous verrez les liens à côté de notre émission, on va vous les présenter. Alors donc c'est ça le message que nous avons. J'ai aussi Dr Catherine, je ne sais pas if do you have something to say about Miss Heritage Global to support Jules Djunga in English?
Absolutely, I think that would be very important. The Miss Heritage Global is a fantastic new competition, and it will be important to support Miss Congo.
Okay, perfect. So Nous sommes en direct des États-Unis. We are in the United States of America, in Vermont, dans la ville de Burlington. Alors tout le monde vous supporte. Alors maintenant, nous allons passer à notre sujet d'aujourd'hui, qui est très très important. Je vais parler en lingala aussi. Bandeko, lelo tozali na sujet moko très très important. Na otoloba makambo ya liboso pona Miss Heritage Global. Jules Junga to soutenir bandeko banso to voter ye. En Swahili tunatoka mkusema mambo ya concours kunapitikana ku Afrique du Sud. Itakuwa le 24 septembre ku Limpopo. Alors tuko na candidat wetu atarepresente nchi yetu kule Jules Junga. Tunamiomba wandugu wote tumuvote. Tuende ku page Facebook yake. Chaque jour tuko na droit kuvote sauti moya ti le 23. Batu yote biko na musairia pour que apate kuweza. Mais leo hii tuko na sujet moya na muinvite Dr. Catherine. Tutasema mambo juu ya mambo ya bangi ku français cannabis ou bien terme mingine marijuana. Tutasema hao mingi leo tuyue kitu kaniko, kitu kanitatusaidia, koma tunaweza kuproteger batoto wetu. En lingala lelo tuloba makambo itali makambo bangi ou bien cannabis ou bien marijuana. Yango lelo na bengisi Dr. Catherine azali spécialiste ya makambo yango ako se présenter moko malgré que français uzamwa mbilinga mais akoloba en anglais et puis tokomeka mpe ko balusa muke. Alors donc nous allons commencer notre émission d'aujourd'hui. Nous allons parler sur le cannabis, marijuana, et vous allez comprendre aussi qu'est-ce que le THC, c'est quoi, hein, les dangers dans la santé, comment nous allons protéger nos enfants, hein, pour qu'ils soient vraiment hors de cette pratique, pour les aider à bien être responsables, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de conséquences au niveau social et aussi au niveau de la santé. Nous pouvons nous retrouver maintenant beaucoup de jeunes qui ne connaissent pas, après avoir pris, ils font des bêtises, ils vont dans des prisons 15 ans, 20 ans. Alors ce n'est pas bien. Nous sommes venus ici améliorer la vie pour que les enfants puissent avoir une bonne éducation à l'école, en famille et dans la communauté des responsables. Alors, Dr. Catherine, so can you introduce yourself? Talk a little bit about your biography.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Catherine Antley. I'm a community physician in Burlington, Vermont. Been pretty active in trying to educate Vermonters and others about the potential harms of cannabis. And we can talk a little bit about those risks as we go through the show, if you like.
OK. Alors, on va la présenter un peu aussi en français. Elle est docteur en médecine, diplômée de l'école de médecine de l'Université de Caroline du Nord et a terminé sa résidence en pathologie anatomique et clinique au Duke University Medical Center. Alors, elle a fait des recherches dans le département de dermatopathologie à l'Université d'Arkansas pour les sciences médicales. Et puis, elle est certifiée en pathologie anatomique et clinique et en dermatopathologie et est membre de l'American Society of Dermatopathology. Alors, elle travaille pendant 20 ans. Elle a été directrice du laboratoire de Vermont, de dermatopathologie, département de Vermont. Donc, on essaie un peu de combiner. C'est un laboratoire vraiment de dermatopathologie indépendant appartenant à une femme desservant Vermont, New York et puis New Hampshire. Elle s'intéresse vivement à la santé publique. C'est ce que nous faisons maintenant là. Et la prévention et à l'exploration de l'impact des politiques sur la toxicomanie et les coûts des soins de santé. Et elle a écrit aussi beaucoup de choses. Elle a coécrit un certain nombre de résolutions de Vermont Medical Society sur le cannabis, Bangi, et a organisé et dirigé une délégation de 10 Vermontois en Islande, oui, pour en savoir plus sur leurs 20 ans d'histoire avec succès dans la lutte contre les taux de dépendance historiquement élevés des pays en utilisant un modèle de prévention scientifique. Elle a contribué à un chapitre Cannabis in Dermatology au manuel Cannabis in Medicine, une evidence-based approach édité par le Dr Ken Finn et publié par Springer Nature. Alors, un jour, je vais l'amener au Congo pour aller établir aussi un programme parce que nous avons aussi beaucoup de jeunes qui dérapent maintenant et ils sont inconscients, ne connaissent pas ce qu'ils font. Entre autres, ils utilisent les chichas. Donc, il y a beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de phénomènes qui se passent maintenant en République démocratique du Congo. Donc, dans le cadre de la coopération et dans le cadre de International Academy on the Science and Impact of Cannabis, nous allons organiser un projet pour aller aussi apporter l'information, éduquer, former pour que les jeunes soient bien protégés. Alors, nous allons parcourir nos questions. Alors, peut-être, si je parle en français, vous comprenez?
Ça va.
Ok, ça va. Parlez un tout petit peu de cannabis et puis THC, c'est quoi?
Il faut que je parle anglais.
Oui, bien sûr que oui.
Okay. I'd like to start by just a little ad. We have a program coming up on the 8th and 9th of October here in Burlington and Johnson, Vermont. 2 programs back to back, and it's for families that are impacted by a loved one's use disorder or severe mental illness. And it's also, the second part is for providers who are treating the family members. So in Vermont, we've had a lot of focus on folks who are suffering from use disorder, but what we realize is that the family members and the people around them are suffering PTSD and lots of anxiety and mental challenges, and they also need support.
Okay.
And so this is hopefully, we're bringing Dr. Libby Stout from Colorado, who's a well-known psychiatrist, and she'll be speaking to us. So anyway, if you're interested in coming, please register, and it's a sliding fee, so you can come for free if you don't. It's a $10 fee for the lunch. So I hope everyone can come. So your first question to me was, what are the potential harms of cannabis, especially high THC? So I'll start with looking at, this is a slide that was produced by Dr. Bertha Madras, and it's a really lovely presentation of a study that I think is emblematic of the fact that high THC is really an environmental risk factor. So the higher the THC, the more people feel like it's not harmful, and the more they use, the more impact a community is going to have. And what we see that impact with cannabis is mental illness. So what we in Amsterdam, where the concentration is very high and people use a lot, 1 out of every 2 first presentations of psychosis would not have occurred if they hadn't been using cannabis. So that's a huge mental health and public health and healthcare cost burden on a community. As the concentration increases and the use increases, our burden of mental illness and addiction increases. This is very important. So if you look at a place like Palmero, Italy, which has low potency and low use, their impact of mental illness is very low. So in Vermont, we have a lot of homeless people. If you have psychosis, if you have schizophrenia, it's very difficult, it's very challenging to find housing, to stay in housing. So if you want to address homelessness and a housing issue, part of that is decreasing the environmental risk factors that are increasing the underlying conditions, increasing homelessness, like schizophrenia, like psychosis. So the next thing that we see is, this is more of the same. As we see the concentration increase, so the red line increases first, the concentration of THC, there's a delay, and then the green line is the increase in use disorder and mental illness. So it's a very clear increased concentration of THC, increased mental illness in your community, and therefore you will have increased homelessness and other burdens on your healthcare system and whatnot. What can be done? In Quebec, they capped the THC at 30%. They did not see an increase in illicit products, which is very important because that's one of the things that they talk about. And they had decreased use of high THC concentrations. So the mental illness is going to go down, your dependence, addiction is going to go down, mental illness is going to go down. There are other risk factors as well, cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and if we have time, we can now show the video on the cannabis hyperemesis syndrome.
Where the drug itself is actually making people sick.
What these patients really have been experiencing is cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome.
This is something that's caused by chronic marijuana use.
CHS has only been recognized for about the past decade, and nobody knows exactly how many people suffer from it.
There's concern that we will see more and more cases of CHS.
All I want to do is feel better. I don't feel like myself. I don't feel safe. Every morning I'm really just in bed, gagging.
I threw up all day, every day for 14 days.
5 straight days of just throwing up every day, not being able to eat.
Man, I couldn't keep a drop of water down.
I was completely convinced that I was gonna die.
I was fighting just to stay in this world.
This is a problem and people don't know.
I didn't know it was possible that it would mess up your stomach to that extent.
Every single person I've told what this is was blown away, had no clue that it existed.
I couldn't travel, I couldn't go to work, I couldn't hang out with my friends, I couldn't eat food that I liked. It ruins everything.
For people who experienced it, it is extremely disturbing and debilitating and may be more common than we imagine.
Heat is the one thing that makes you feel better.
I was probably in the bath about 8 hours per day.
Yeah, I probably do 20 showers a day.
The water's so hot that it's scalding them.
Severely burned my back from all the showering I was doing. I was just cooking myself.
I was so desperate for relief. It is literally so much better than the pain that's in my stomach, to a point where I'd rather burn myself than deal with the pain that I have.
I've never been in so much pain in my life. I missed an entire year of work. I was so deeply in denial, I never even Googled the symptoms of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome.
People with CHS are suffering for years with symptoms and are having multiple hospitalizations and hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical bills.
Close to 20 years that I suffered without having any knowledge of CHS at all.
You tell people what you have and they don't believe it.
Nobody believes it.
Nobody believes it.
They just can't understand it. Like, it's got to be something else.
He just couldn't believe. He was like, Mom, I just don't understand. They always told us pot was harmless.
I had all kinds of tests. They removed my appendix. If anything, they said that the smoking the cannabis would help.
The nurse told me about it, and I go, no, I just, that's just not true. Marijuana is completely benign. Nobody has died from marijuana. Well, it turns out that's not true either.
In his final hospitalization, he had not eaten for more than 50 days. I kept saying to them, listen, I don't think this kid's gonna make it.
People can actually die from this, and nobody takes it seriously.
This is about a 17-year-old child lost his life over something that could have easily been prevented. I want education. I was not able to save him, but I'm gonna make sure that his story is out there and some people are helped.
I want as many people as I can pretty much be educated on it.
There's people in the medical industry and in the marijuana industry who are potentially giving out advice to try and deal with this problem that could lead to somebody dying.
I thought transparency was part of the promise of legalized pot, and no one has been transparent.
We are not trying to demonize marijuana.
It is a wonder herb. It just needs to be used correctly, not abused.
We have no research. We don't know anything about it, really, because we've never studied it.
I think it's very important that we get research done so that way more people don't get sick.
So the next slide is looking at why is it that the perception of harm goes down and people are experiencing worse adverse consequences. So in Vermont, we're seeing more addiction. We're seeing more mental illness associated with cannabis use, more suicidality associated with cannabis use, more cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, so vomiting associated with cannabis use, and yet the perception of harm of cannabis is going down. Why is it? That's paradoxical. You'd think as the adverse consequences increase, people would have a higher, have more fear of the drug. So what's happening is that we're having very highly paid lobbyists, very sophisticated folks, putting out information, and I have a slide which we can show in a minute, which takes a direct quote from something that was put out in a well-educated, well-intentioned community of Middlebury. And it says, and I quote, every study ever conducted in any state on underage cannabis use following legalization has concluded that legalization does not lead to an increase in underage cannabis use. This is a lie. This is factually inaccurate. And when you put the slide up, you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide, so there you have it now, there are 3 studies, and there are more, that show that as cannabis use increase, as cannabis shops increase, youth use rate will increase. We saw this in California. We saw this in Oregon. And in addition, what we've seen is that where the cannabis store is located is important. So if your child or family member is near a pot shop, is near an outlet which is selling cannabis, then that young person, that youth, that child, or your wife, husband, father, mother, your loved one is more likely to use, more likely to relapse. And that's what we're seeing in the 4th reference on that slide as well.
Alors, une petite question d'abord. Quels sont les effets positifs des THC du point de vue médical?
So there have been folks who have said, and originally they have said that if we legalize marijuana, we'll have less opiate use. That study was done 5 years ago. It was repeated exactly in Stanford, so they did a repeat, and it showed exactly the opposite effect. So many of the things that are being put forward as, quote, medical are not working out. As time goes on, we see that, so for example, in Colorado, opiate overdose rates have shot up, even though they have a lot of cannabis. So there's not good evidence. And in fact, if you use cannabis, you're 4 times as likely to become addicted to opiates. So there's a lot of the things that they're putting forward as potentially helpful have not turned out to be so.
Okay, so what are the science-based warnings suggested by our state's doctors? Are these on the labels?
So they are not on the labels. I'll skip ahead to that question. These are the science-based warnings that the Vermont Medical Society came up with. Psychosis, impaired driving, addiction, suicide attempt, uncontrolled vomiting, harm to fetus and nursing baby. Now, the Cannabis Control Board in Vermont was tasked with putting labels on our cannabis. And those labels are not, that label is not. So people who buy cannabis in Vermont, when they look at the label, they do not see psychosis, suicidality. They do not see cannabis hyperemesis syndrome or vomiting. So these are important, as we just saw, cannabis hyperemesis syndrome is a potentially deadly condition. It can ruin your life. It can lead to unnecessary surgeries. And most folks are pretty much unaware of that eventuality. Suicide attempt, addiction. So the Cannabis Control Board put on their label that it may be habit forming. So walking my dog is habit forming. Brushing my teeth is habit forming. So good things are habit forming. Addiction is not a good thing. It's destructive. It's gotten in the way of relationships or of your profession. So we put on, the medical society suggested addiction, straightforward, impaired drivings, and psychosis. So Vermonters, when they buy their cannabis and they look at the label, it won't say psychosis, even though that's a well-established result of use of high THC, regular high THC cannabis. It's important to note that high THC cannabis is defined as 10 to 15% THC, which is almost not found anymore in Colorado and California and other legal states. So this is not what people think of. It's not 100% THC. It's still dangerous at 10 and 15% cannabis concentrations. I just wanted to go back to the issue of this placement of the shops. So we know that the placement of the shops, the closer your kid lives to the pot shop, the more likely they are to use. We talked about that. And what we also know is that industry, if we show this slide about industry targets vulnerable individuals, targets vulnerable populations, we see that studies show that increased distribution of dispensaries in underprivileged and minority communities. And so there are a lot of studies. I've picked 2 of them, and you can see them hopefully on the screen. One was the finding of the study support the hypothesis that cannabis retailers are more likely to locate in relatively deprived neighborhoods, suggesting the need to consider where a pot shop is located. And most deprived areas have increased likelihood of licensed cannabis shops, or have increased density when compared to other less deprived areas. So what we know is that the cannabis industry only makes money, 80% of their product is consumed by just 20% or less. So they're dependent on a very small percentage of consumers to turn a profit. And those folks are dependent. So dependence is what they're striving for. And when you put a pot shop next to a community, that community is more likely to have more users, more folks who are dependent. And then there's the extraction of wealth from that community, usually to Wall Street, to people who are very wealthy, usually men, usually whites. And so it's unfair when you put pot shops near areas that are deprived or neighborhoods, then you are extracting wealth from those neighborhoods and enriching other portions of the community, which is very unfair, and I think something is important for Burlington to pay attention to. And this is something we had on the screen a little while ago. Actually, the Department of Health studied what happened after we legalized marijuana, and the increase in use was disproportional in those earning less than $25,000 a year and those with less than a high school education. So it's very important that decision makers and Burlingtonians pay attention to this and put some guardrails in place so that we protect our vulnerable populations, basically. And there's also a lot of information that shows that once you legalize marijuana, your arrests in minority communities does not go down. So the ACLU found that there was no amelioration in the rate at which minority folks were arrested. And there was a study right here at the University of Vermont who saw the same thing. So this is very important. I don't think it gets a lot of play. I think it's important that we pay attention to that.
So one quick question. So can Vermonters increase the distance between a shop and their kids? And can they have accurate health warnings? And also, can the dangerous THC concentrate be kept? What can citizens do?
Absolutely. I think this is the most important question. What can we do? We know that one thing that's clear is that if Burlington wants to increase, right now in Burlington you can have a pot shop right next door to a nursery or a daycare or a playground. I'll just repeat that. Right now, according to the rules that the Cannabis Control Board have put in place, we can put a legal pot shop selling drugs right next door to a playground, right next door to a nursery, and just 500 feet from a school. So from first graders or kindergartners or middle schoolers or high schoolers, 500 feet. We all know how far that is, just a little bit more than and not very far. So we can change that. We have I think we're going to have a local cannabis control board in Burlington. We can say, you know what, we want it farther, because we know that the farther the shop is from kids, the less likely they are to use. Will it be on their walk to school? You know, can we prevent them from passing a pot shop as they walk to school? What about advertising? Burlington can make rules that say, you know what, we're not going to have any advertising that targets kids. We're not going to have any advertising that's 4 feet or less, or that a child can understand. And another important thing that Burlington can do is to put public health and physicians on their cannabis control boards.
Yep.
So right now, folks, it was news last week, the head of the Cannabis Control Commission in Massachusetts, who came from the marijuana industry, is going into the marijuana industry. So all the rules that are regulating, supposedly protecting the public, that he made, he's now in a position to profit from selling marijuana. So this is something that we could prevent. We can put people on the marijuana commissions, the Cannabis Control Board, both in the state and in the town, who have public health backgrounds, like yourself, for example. Or we can put in rules that say, if you serve on the Cannabis Control Board, you won't be allowed to go into the industry targeting youth to targeting youth, creating more addiction. So that would prevent that revolving door of lobbyists going into, or of regulators then going into industry.
Alors, encore 3 minutes. Les actions maintenant. Can you talk a little bit about actions, what we have to do, or you have some kind of propositions or suggestions? Qu'est-ce que nous devons faire?
En français.
En français, un peu, pour faire plaisir.
C'est très dur.
Pour faire plaisir à nos téléspectateurs. Nous sommes presque à la fin de notre émission.
Il faut qu'il y ait beaucoup de, comment ça dit? On ne veut pas avoir un marijuana à côté de l'école, oui. Ouais. On veut un peu mettre
un peu plus distant de l'école, là où il y a des enfants et dans beaucoup d'endroits. Donc,
ça c'est très important. Ça va, oui. Et ça c'est quelque chose des gens en Burlington peut faire. Ouais. Et puis advertising, comment ça dit? Comment ça dit? Publicité. Un moyen de publicité.
Moins de publicité, oui.
Pour que des enfants peuvent voir. So, des enfants marcher à l'école. On ne veut pas qu'il y ait une publicité entre la maison et l'école.
Oui.
La chemin doit être. Et puis, le troisième chose, c'est très important d'avoir des médecins, des gens publics.
On fait la santé publique dans les boards pour bien réguler les choses, contrôler les choses.
Oui. C'est ça.
Ok, très bien. Nous sommes arrivés presque à la fin de notre émission. Nous venons de parler les dangers du cannabis ou du marijuana. Vous savez que c'est légal maintenant, comme nous venons. Ce que vous devez comprendre en quelques mots est que quand la concentration de THC est élevée, que beaucoup de gens ignorent, il y a des complications, il y a des problèmes de santé mentale, il y a l'addiction, la dépendance, et ça peut créer toute une panoplie de choses au niveau de la santé de l'individu, voire même certaines infractions sociales, parce que quand quelqu'un devient dépendant, il n'a plus le contrôle. D'où nos enfants peuvent aller facilement en prison si nous ne faisons pas attention. Et puis, comme c'est légal, il faudrait que nous soyons attentifs de surveiller pour que ces maisons-là soient vraiment distantes de l'école et puis qu'il y ait moins de publicité pour que nos enfants ne soient pas vraiment à l'abri de tout ça. Alors, il est grand temps, Bandeko, Toyebike, bangi comme illégal epa na biso bafungola bastore na bastore wana ezali na place oyo bandeko oyo biso tozali ebele baminoritaire. Alors tosala attention tozala vraiment na bokengi nyonso pour que makambo wana ezala musika na ekole ya bana bapublicité ezala moins tocontrôle neti bandeko bamosusu basali santé publique tozala mpe na bode wana mpo toyeba ndenge na koregulare parce soki tolobi te motu moko akolobela biso aza te. Toyaki na bana awa bana babotami awa tosalisa bango bazwa éducation ya bien baza mpe baresponsable na société. Kwa kumaliza bangi hapa kwetu bana inakuwa iko kusheria batafungula magazin alo tukue tutire attention pour que kwe mbali na masomo ya batoto et puis publicité shiko ya mingi tufe nguvu yote batoto bashoni publicité ile juu ibatume baanje kuvuta bangi parce que bakavuta bangi ile italeta maproblema ya kicho, italeta maproblema kila siku mtoto kama ya kamata shiki mzuri saa ingine makonsekansi ingine kifo iko na tanasa jue moya et puis kwenda ku prison aina mzuri. Tulikuya hapa ni juu tusaidie batoto. Alors nous sommes arrivés à la fin de notre émission d'aujourd'hui African Variety Show. C'est notre premier anniversaire aujourd'hui depuis que nous avions commencé l'année passée, le 25 août 2021, le 25 août 2022. Alors nous disons aussi merci à Dr Catherine qui est tellement brave, qui s'engage beaucoup plus pour que nous puissions être vraiment attentifs et puis prudents. Alors see you next time for another number. Ça sera au mois de septembre. Allez, nous vous saluons. Merci et à la prochaine.